Well, welcome to Talking Science. Dr. Adrian McCallum from the University of the Sunshine Coast is here to discuss yesterday's earthquake near Mansfield in Victoria. Dr. McCallum, thanks for your time.
Matt, nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
This is Trekzone's Talkin' Science. And you can get exclusive behind-the-scenes info and first-play access to all Trekzone podcasts by becoming a member today. Click join on every Trekzone video on YouTube. Go to the trek.zone/support or scan the QR code on screen throughout the show. Now, it's back to you, Matt.
Well, thank you very much, Ross. And a quick mention of our socials, Trekzone's on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, your favourite podcast feed. Find us, like, follow and subscribe. Leave comments and ratings. That'll help us convince the algorithm we're worth it. Adrian, yesterday's earthquake was a reminder to us that they can happen in our part of the world, but they're not very common, are they?
No, look, that's right, Matt. I think we go about our day-to-day business without thinking too much about earthquakes because, as you say, they rarely actually impact our day-to-day lives. Most of us perhaps think of New Zealand when we think of, when major earthquakes have occurred recently. So, look, I was just as surprised as anyone, I think, to see earthquake in Melbourne, particularly of that sort of magnitude, pop up on my news feed yesterday. So I certainly have been brushing up on a bit of earthquake science over the last 24 hours, and it's fascinating stuff.
It absolutely is. Well, Australia sits on a continental plate that's travelling north at about 7 centimetres per year. So we're not necessarily living on top of it, or we're not living on a fault line like somewhere, say, California. But what do we experience when an earthquake strikes?
Well, look, it's quite interesting because when it happened yesterday, I had just finished teaching my soil mechanics students, and we were talking about compressive stresses within soil. And essentially, the Australian plate is just a big piece of soil and rock. And of course, if those compressive stresses build up, which occurs if the plate moves to the north at 7 centimetres a year, then something eventually has to give. That stress has to be relieved. So that's essentially what happened yesterday in Mansfield, in the Alpine region of Victoria. The stress was relieved upon an existing fault line. So it occurred as shear. And an earthquake resulted from that stress release.
And the length of that fault rupture is estimated to be about 1.4 kilometres. Now, that's twice the size of the one that formed during the 1989 Newcastle earthquake. But thankfully, the location here played a key role. It's an area that's sparsely populated, so we didn't see necessarily a lot of damage, some damage that we are seeing here on screen in Melbourne, surprisingly enough. A little further away, some damage in the regional towns as well. Depth was also an interesting fact. 10 kilometres down, not very deep for an earthquake.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. One of the first things I did yesterday was go to the geological maps of Mansfield. And if your viewers care to take a look, they're easily accessible. And they showed lots and lots of faults in the vicinity of Mansfield. And of course, some of these faults are vertical and some of these faults are horizontal. And there's a whole array of them down to 10 kilometres depth and beyond. So when you look at that and you take the time to understand that there are all these, mainly hidden voids or shear zones in the ground beneath us, then when this sort of thing occurs, it makes you realise that actually, as you said at the start, perhaps we shouldn't be quite so surprised that earthquakes do pop up every now and again all over the place.
Now, we've seen Meckering in Western Australia rocked by a 6.6 magnitude in 68. Peterman in the Northern Territory in 2016 endured a 6.1 magnitude, and the Newcastle quake that I mentioned earlier from 1989 was a 5.6 magnitude on the Richter scale. So we have a little bit of a stable range of quakes in our recorded history. They're certainly up there in their ferocity. Why is that so?
I think it would be very hard to try and tie down, and they say this, earthquakes are hard to predict because although we can probably approximate the sort of stress that is building up in the continent of Australia as we drift to the north, unless we know exactly where all those potential shear zones are, those existing faults, then it's very hard to say, well, which one of them is going to release next or the most, and by how much is that going to relieve that stress and therefore generate an earthquake. So as you suggest, I think we can learn a lot by just looking empirically at what's occurred in the past. And I was looking at a map that perhaps your viewers have seen of historical earthquakes in Australia. And of course, there are pockets where they seem to pop up. So I was speaking with a lady in Sydney earlier today about constructing dams in earthquake-prone regions, and I suggested to her that, yes, I think we do need to be careful about major infrastructure, etc. Seismicity is something we need to consider. We can't just go building things willy-nilly because nature has a way of reminding us who's boss.
Yeah, exactly right. Now, as you were saying, you were teaching compressive stress in your class yesterday, just as the earthquake was happening. Can you give us a bit of a general overview of what exactly that is and why that release does happen?
Well, I suppose we were talking about soil in particular, which is a particulate, as opposed to rock, which is essentially bound soil. And although the stresses might be compressive coming in from side to side, soil and rock tends to fail in shear. So we get sliding planes upon which movement will occur. So the strength that those planes have depends on the normal forces that are pushing them together and their frictional characteristics. Once that imposed stress exceeds the strength that that shear zone has, then we can expect some slip along that shear plane. And as you mentioned, it depends on the composition of the rock, the depth, the stresses at play, as to what sort of distance that stress release might occur over. But we see similar things. That's what fascinates me about geomechanics, whether we're looking at a couple of grains or whether we're looking at continents, the same general physical principles can be applied and observed.
Just on a larger scale in terms of a continental shelf. You mentioned major infrastructure along these sort of fault lines, not necessarily fault lines, but where these earthquakes are prone to be. Are there other things that we should be looking at for future-proofing Australia and the way that we're sort of acting, or do we sort of have to learn to live with them a little bit like California?
Look, I think you make a good point, Matt. I think because this only pops up now and again, it's perhaps not at the top of our mind when we're considering major infrastructure projects. But you mentioned the Meckering earthquake earlier. I think there's historic pictures of that, buckling rail lines, etc., over in the west. So, yeah, maybe we should learn from countries like Japan or New Zealand, where they have to deal with bigger earthquakes more regularly, and they use isolation systems in their foundations and their footings to isolate the infrastructure from the earth that's shaking beneath. So I think we need to do a bit more work in that regard, whether it's for fixed infrastructure like buildings, even for things like roads and railways. Perhaps we need to have a checkbox that says, have we considered how that infrastructure might respond in terms of an earthquake, or at least get the engineers to have a look at the earthquake potential for that area to assess whether or not that should be a consideration in the development of whatever infrastructure might be.
Now, the quake was felt from Adelaide to Sydney, Canberra as well. Melbourne saw some damage, as we saw in our pictures, even Launceston as well. How does this ground force transmit in such a wide area?
So it will depend on the stiffness of the ground, and a stiffer soil or a stiffer rock will transmit the waves further. So that will essentially dictate to what radius it might extend in any particular direction. If we've got loose sediments, then it may not progress as far as if we've got stiff rock. So again, by looking at the geological makeup of the area, then seismologists and geologists can probably suggest that it might transmit to a certain direction by a certain amount. And of course, by looking at seismographs in a radius around the quake site, they can validate their models essentially of how that wave might propagate throughout the soil and rock.
Certainly one to watch, and we're going to be seeing damage bills coming in the weeks to come, and also the cleanup happening as well. I was also reading that this magnitude of earthquakes, 6 and above, is happening in Australia about every decade. Incredible to think that we have that frequency of earthquakes as well. As we travel further north, do you think we'll be experiencing more as we sort of move into more continental shelves?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. I must say I haven't done any digging, but someone must be monitoring that rate of about 7 centimetres per annum to the north to see whether that's slowing down or whether it's accelerating. And I suppose if we can answer that question, then perhaps we can then suggest whether or not the rate of earthquakes will increase or decrease over time. If our plate is slowing down and perhaps not generating quite so much stress so regularly, then perhaps they will dissipate. But yeah, I'll have to do some more digging, sorry, Matt, and see if we can come up with an answer to that question. It's a good one.
Pardon the pun, of course.
Of course.
Well, Dr. Adrian McCallum from the University of the Sunshine Coast, I really appreciate your time today. Interesting facts developing from this earthquake. Not an irregular occurrence here in Australia, but certainly the first one in Talking Science's life. So I really appreciate your time today.
Great to meet you, Matt, and thanks for having me. All the best.